Want to learn how to make videos like us? Find out after the video how we use insights from vidIQ as our secret YouTube weapon and get a 98% discount. You heard that right, 98% off. But you've got to stick around to the end of the video to find out how you can try vidIQ for yourself for just $1 for 30 days and start making your own hit YouTube videos in no time. 1 year into the war in Ukraine, and Russia's facing the greatest challenges it's faced over 40 years. But new developments might just doom its efforts to win in Ukraine. When it comes to Russia's problems in Ukraine, the list is exhaustive. But lately, one problem has been hampering its efforts to launch the dreaded spring offensive most Western analysts had feared would come. The Russian Ministry of Defense has done a good job of pumping out a steady stream of propaganda fuel meant to paint a widely inaccurate picture of the situation in Ukraine. According to Russian MOD videos put out on a nearly daily basis, Russian troops are on the move across the east, steadily pushing back overwhelmed Ukrainian forces as they break under the weight of Russian tanks and helicopters. When not showing heavily edited videos of their troops engaged in glorious combat, the Russian MOD shares videos of one of their fancy statues decapitating America's Lady Liberty in a one-on-one duel. Russia's taken internet tough guy to a completely different level. But videos coming from the troops themselves paint a wildly different picture of the situation on the ground for the Russian army. Since last fall, a steady stream of videos made by troops requesting aid from various government officials have hit the internet. The format's always the same. A group of Russian soldiers stands together, typically hiding their faces for fear of reprisal, and then they record a video airing their grievances.
Обращение о военную прокуратуру Российской Федерации и Министерство обороны Российской Федерации. Мы мобилизованы из Тюменской области, были призваны осенью и зачислены в батальон 1641 «Росомаха», где проходили обучение в течение 3-5 месяцев по своим должностям. По приезду на Украину 4-я рота была раскидана по частям ДНР и смена наших вузов без нашего согласия. Мы пытаемся на месте выяснить, но все безрезультатно.
These grievances are pretty much the same, like in the previous video where the mobilized soldiers received specialized training only to be thrown straight into the front lines upon arriving in Ukraine. It's a complaint that is increasingly common as the 300,000 conscripts mobilized by Russia in response to Ukraine's stunningly successful counteroffensive have been joining the war in force. Initially, a group of these mobics were simply thrown directly to the front with little to no training.
We've got this shit for training. Knows what kind of house we're at. 3 armor-piercing cartridges. We're in Svatov, you guys.
Мы в Сватово находимся. Какая область?
Луганская.
What region? Luhansk region. We are mobilized. We don't have to be here at all. 11 days from when we were deployed. We left Moscow 11 days ago. How many times did you shoot already? Once. 3 bullet cartridges.
This wasn't an accident, though. It was the same type of sadistic tactical thinking that's prevailed in Russia since the earliest days of the Soviet Union. With the front line across the north of the country collapsing, Russia needed to throw bodies at the problem until the line stabilized, and it accomplished this, sacrificing as many as an estimated 25,000 mobilized conscripts who'd received at best a week of training. In Russia, life is cheap, and sacrificing men for time is simple strategic doctrine for Russian commanders. As the wars progressed, a steady stream of videos from Russians complaining about their situation has hit the internet. The intent is typically a cry for help. Men mobilized with little training, either complaining about a lack of leadership, equipment, or about being trained in one specialty only to be used as cannon fodder. Some Russian soldiers have even been transferred under the command of separatist units and inevitably being used as disposable cannon fodder to soften up Ukrainian positions.
Обращается к вам мобилизованный Иркутской области полка 1439, отправленный в ДНР с города Новосибирска 31 декабря 2022 года. Просим посодействовать и разобраться с беззаконным и преступными приказами нашего командования. Они заключаются в том, что нас передали в подчинение 1-й славянской бригаде ДНР, где из нас солдат территориальной обороны за один день сформировали штурмовые подразделения.
The soldiers typically complain of lacking equipment or proper support, and then in the previous video of literally being called disposable by their new commanders. The videos are almost always directed at President Vladimir Putin himself or some other authority from their home region. What's especially pathetic is the belief by these troops that Vladimir Putin gives a single damn about any of them and would respond to these videos with anything but immediate punishment. In fact, we have multiple reports of Russian soldiers being imprisoned for refusing to follow orders that would send them to their deaths or recording similar videos calling for help. No matter how hard Russia tries to hide the truth from its population, though, news of how bad things are going inevitably reach back home. Soldiers are increasingly having their phones confiscated upon entering Ukraine, but many of them simply hide them or write highly critical letters back home. Others steal Ukrainian phones to dial home with. The wounded also bring stories back to the home front of just how bad conditions are in Ukraine. This inevitably has even led Russian citizens to making the same style of videos publicly asking for help. More often than not, the videos are addressed to local politicians, such as in this one recorded by the wives of men mobilized and sent to fight against armored vehicles and even tanks with little heavy equipment to support them.
Мы жены мобилизованных города Бийска. Наши мужья прикомандированы к 55-й бригаде, Республика Тыва, город Кызыл.
Ротный Маклаков, мобилизованный с города Бийска. Командир Кочнев.
Просим отозвать наших мужей с линии соприкосновений село Житловка.
Unsurprisingly, some of these videos are addressed by concerned wives directly to the commander-in-chief himself. Like in this video, where the women say that they've been ignored by their local authorities. They even complain of having been blocked on the popular Telegram app by both local politicians and the Russian Ministry of Defense. The women complain of a lack of training for their mobilized men and of the extremely unsanitary conditions on the Ukrainian front. Men with chronic diseases are not receiving adequate care, and the women feel that they have no recourse but to appeal to Putin himself. In another video, wives of men attached to DPR separatist forces complain of their men purposefully being used as cannon fodder, while the DPR forces themselves don't commit any of their men to such dangerous assaults.
Мы надеемся на вашу помощь. Наши мужья и сыновья были прикомандированы к одной из частей армии в Донецкой Народной Республике, после чего жены стали получать тревожные звонки от своих мужей, в каждом из которых
The callous disregard for the lives of Russian soldiers is staggering. A Western unit being placed under the command of a foreign force and then used as cannon fodder would be enough to start a riot back home. Good thing democracy is fake in Russia, or else Putin would be in hot water come this next election cycle. The steady stream of videos from both men at the front and their wives and mothers back home are all eating away at Russian civilian morale. Just like their military, a civilian population's morale is critical to a successful campaign, as a demoralized population will become increasingly harder to control, let alone mobilize and order into combat. But complaints from the front aren't the only bad news Russia's dealing with, as the military itself is narrowly avoiding all-out war against itself. For months now, the Wagner mercenary group, now officially labeled a terrorist organization by the United States for their many human rights abuses, has been leading the charge across the East. What few successes Russia has had against determined Ukrainian defenders have largely been thanks to Wagner. But now it looks as if Wagner and the Russian military are on the splits, and it's causing more damage than the Kanye-Kim K split. Wagner leader and shoe-in for Lurch in a Russian remake of Adam's Family, Yevgeny Prigozhin, has famously been beefing like a butcher with the entire Russian military establishment, claiming that it was his force that stemmed the Ukrainian onslaught last autumn. Prigozhin, who has a face for radio, has been clearly making a serious power play in the Kremlin. Most analysts believe he wishes to be appointed Minister of Defense, replacing resident bad boy, and we mean bad as in he's terrible at his job, Sergei Shoigu. Thus, Prigozhin has been using his access to Putin and his successes on the battlefield to try to diminish and belittle Shoigu and the Russian military on the whole. But it seems Prigozhin bit off more borscht than he could chew, and now Shoigu seems to have all but neutered Wagner inside of Ukraine. The drama started to unfold with the taking of Soledar, a minor town that Russia hailed as a military victory of the millennium. And to be fair, for the Russians, taking a small salt mining town successfully really was the victory of the millennium. Wagner claimed responsibility for the victory, even posting a photo of themselves inside one of the salt mines. However, the Russian MOD announced that it had been the Russian military, not Wagner, who had accomplished this great feat of which military historians will speak about for days to come. Prigozhin's dreams of being compared to the likes of Alexander the Great for taking a salt mine would crumble like, well, salt, as the MOD took all the credit. Evidence strongly suggests that it had indeed been Wagner, using human wave attacks of recruited prisoners who had in fact been largely responsible for taking the town. However, it's likely that the MOD badly needed a propaganda victory to prove to the population back home that its military was not, in fact, complete clown shoes. It's even more likely, however, that Shoigu is finally launching a counterattack against Prigozhin's political machinations. To the surprise of everyone, but probably not one more than Prigozhin himself, Putin seemed to back up Shoigu, and Wagner's contributions to the victory were quickly erased from Russian media. In fact, most mentions of Wagner began to disappear from Russian media, and it wasn't long after that reports of Wagner being shunned on the battlefield began to surface. According to Wagner officials, the Russian army has refused to share supplies with Wagner or even support their assaults with artillery. It seems like Shoigu is set out to destroy his political rival, but that hasn't stopped Prigozhin and his well-funded Wagner PMC from continuing to claim victories, especially around Bakhmut. Recently, Wagner announced it had captured several villages outside of Bakhmut itself, which came as a great surprise to the Ukrainian soldiers currently sitting in those villages, defending them. Prigozhin, which has long enjoyed Putin's close support, has seemingly been put out in the cold. But did Prigozhin miscalculate the relationship between Shoigu and Putin? Or were his constant complaints about the Russian military even too much for Putin to take? Having an insider criticize the military in a way that no propagandist on Russian TV would dare to was likely too much for Putin to continue to allow. But it's also possible that Putin doesn't truly favor Shoigu or Prigozhin over the other. For a dictator, the only thing more important than ensuring the loyalty of the men under you is ensuring that they hate each other even more. That's the only way to prevent a palace coup. And given the increasing cost to Russia from Putin's disastrous invasion, a coup is very likely high on his list of worries at the moment. Complaining soldiers, citizens taking to the internet to publicly air their grievances, and now the Russian military beefing with the most successful part of the Russian invasion. With all the problems facing Putin, the West just added a 60-ton complication. At the start of the war, Ukraine immediately requested heavy equipment such as tanks. The West was slow to respond, then gradually rounded up as many Soviet-era tanks as they could wrangle from NATO's Eastern European counterparts. It was clear that those would soon run out, though, and despite many extremely generous donations by the Russians themselves, Ukraine would need a continual and steady supply of tanks. This left only one option: modern Western vehicles. But many in the West immediately browned themselves at the thought of making Vladidadi angry by giving Ukraine the tools it needed to defend itself and stop the slaughter of civilians. Slowly, gradually, and despite an incessant stream of threats about escalation, the West at last decided to supply Ukraine with main battle tanks. Now, an estimated 100 Leopard 2s and American Abrams are on their way to Ukraine and, after training, will be on the battlefield by the start of the summer. The U.S. Abrams will take longer to deliver and train on, but the Leopard 1s and Leopard 2s are already in the hands of Ukrainian tank crews training in Poland. While the tanks being sent lack many of the most sophisticated and classified features of those in use by Western armies, they are still a considerable threat to Russia. The U.S. said it'll be stripping the secretive depleted uranium armor used in its tanks and replacing it likely with titanium composite. However, even with the downgraded armor, Western tanks are in effect punching down versus Russia's dwindling stockpile of armored vehicles. Recent reports state that Russia has started fielding T-62s in large numbers, and while Russia will continue to enjoy the numbers advantage, Ukraine will soon enjoy the quality advantage. And quality means a lot here because a Leopard 2 against a T-62 is like pitting a bare-knuckle boxing champion against a senile geriatric with hip issues. Russia is thus trying to do its best to destroy these Western tanks before they even get to Ukraine by targeting you. Putin knows that he can't defeat large numbers of Western tanks on the battlefield, so instead, he's turned to feeding the West a steady diet of propaganda and fear-mongering. He knows the West fears he will escalate to the use of nuclear weapons, and thus has worked hard to make sure the word escalation has been on the lips of every Western news anchor. At this point, if you turn the lights off and say the word escalation 3 times into a mirror, a bloody apparition of Vladimir Putin will appear and threaten to nuke you. Putin's only chance to defeat Western weapons is to make sure they're never sent at all, which is bad news, as it appears that the West is slowly unbrowning their collective panties and starting to send Ukraine the weapons it needs to end the war. With the first delivery of 100 tanks, nations like the US have strongly hinted at ongoing support, which Ukraine will need as battlefield losses mount. Western tanks might be far more capable than what Russia is currently fielding, but inevitably these tanks will be damaged or destroyed, which is why it's critical that the West continue to deliver replacements for the duration of the war. The tank that makes the most sense to send is the Leopard 2, but sadly most European countries are reluctant to deplete their own stockpiles in case of a war, which we're forced to ask the question, what war exactly? Putin's forces are already heavily embroiled in Ukraine, and if his military is unable to conquer even the east of Ukraine, We doubt the Russian T-72s are going to be rolling past the Eiffel Tower and into Madrid anytime soon, so maybe the Western NATO states need to start asking themselves what war exactly do they think they need tanks for when Ukraine is literally holding the line on the war they fear. Ironically, the NATO members most at risk of Russian aggression have been the ones to be the most generous with their support. The Baltic states and Poland have been pulling a great deal of their own equipment from active service to send to Ukraine, with Poland threatening to send its Leopards to Ukraine even without Germany's approval. Poland's been so proactive that when at the start of the war Europe said it would make Putin sad if they supplied Ukraine with jets, Poland went ahead and sent MiG fighters under the guise of spare parts. Slowly but surely, the West is losing its fear of hurting Putin's feelings, and the announcement of tanks for Ukraine was followed by another shipment of HIMARS from the US. Included in new shipments are long-range munitions capable of striking deep behind enemy lines, exactly the type of weapons Ukraine has been asking for since the war began. An aid package announced at the start of February included the US's ground-launched small-diameter bomb, or GLSDB. This weapon has a range of up to 93 miles and consists of a 250-pound bomb attached to a rocket booster. Boosted high up into the sky, the bomb detaches from the spent rocket and deploys wings that it uses to glide to its target, resulting in a greatly extended range. This will nearly double Ukraine's current HIMARS range and can be fired from existing HIMARS units or MLRS systems. The bomb itself was the result of the US having entirely too many 250-pound bombs just lying around. At some point, someone, probably from Georgia or Alabama, got the idea to strap all these spare bombs to a rocket and then give them wings, and the results speak for themselves. The bombs are precision-guided with jam-resistant GPS technology and come in the high-explosive fragmentation or bunker-busting varieties. These weapons will allow Ukraine to push Russian logistics even further away from the front lines, slowing down the ability to launch offensives even more. By making resupply difficult, Ukraine can overwhelm Russian units on the front despite their superior numbers. But just as importantly, it'll force Russian air defenses to attempt to shoot down these bombs, expending valuable air defense missiles. With tanks on their way, Ukraine has taken to breaking down the remaining barriers to giving Ukraine the fighter jets it's been asking for. While Ukraine would never get top-of-the-line Western jets like the F-35, even F-16s would be a significant threat to the Russian Air Force. And as one of the most successful aircraft ever built, there's thousands of F-16s that could potentially be sent to Ukraine. But Ukraine has asked for only 200 of them. And even that's a bold figure given how reluctant the West has been to give anything but small arms. Opposition to sending the F-16 to Ukraine is currently strong, but many countries have signaled a willingness to send jets. As of February 22nd, the US was firmly rejecting the idea of sending any F-16s. But just like the tanks seemed an impossibility at one point, odds are that as the war drags on, Western jets will make an appearance in the skies over Ukraine. With Western jets, Ukraine could challenge Russia's air forces and prevent at least some of the attacks launched against its civilian population. Trying to operate them on the front would be foolhardy, but armed with standoff weapons of their own, F-16s or similar platforms could significantly increase the reach of Ukrainian weapons. It would also prevent Russia from operating close to the front itself, where it's enjoyed greater use of air support than Ukraine. Putin's problems are numerous and seem to be growing by the day. Sadly, though, the longer the West hesitates to send weapons to Ukraine, the more Ukrainian soldiers and civilians die at the hands of the Russian invaders. Now, are you wondering how we come up with the ideas for videos? It's all thanks to vidIQ. vidIQ is a super powerful YouTube tool that basically acts like a cheat code for picking video topics. With vidIQ, you can see exactly how many people are searching for a topic each month, how much competition there is for that topic from other creators, and what videos from those creators are trending. Put all that information together and you can find the perfect video, like we did hopefully with this one. So go check it out for yourself and get vidIQ for just $1 for 30 days. That's 98% off the regular price, but only at vidiq.com/theinfoshow. Now go make Putin cry by watching What to Expect from Russia in 2023, or click this other video instead.